hold you down till we're old and green, reach the golden gates of paradise. That means I got you for life, Bonnie and Clyde. If you along for the ride, we can take on civilization as we know it. Nobody can stop you and I. Move as a unit, a team, with you as my queen. Checkmate these pawns switching sides. Menace to modern society, cause for you I will shoot anybody on sight. Girl, got me feeling invincible, so you leaving I start missing you. Look at the trials that we've been through. Your heartbeats, they matching my tempo. Can nothing come between me and you? The opposite whoever against you. We gon' take out our enemies, as long as you're riding with me. I can be yours if you let me. If you promise.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sridevi Sripathy, and welcome to this conversation. I want to first thank the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival for creating this space, and especially Selena, her first year as a festival director, totally doing it right. I currently am at WHYY, which is the PBS station here in Philadelphia. I am the director of programming and production, and I'm really, really excited to be joined with these guests. But the first thing I want to do is do a land acknowledgement. I am here in Philadelphia, as I mentioned, which is the land of the Lenni Lenape people. My pronouns are she and hers. I am an Indian woman with dark brown skin, black hair. I'm wearing a dark sweater and in a room with a vibrant green background. And I'd like our guests to go ahead and introduce themselves, and then we're going to jump right into it. So whoever wants to jump in, take the lead.
Everyone's trying to be so polite. I'll start. My name is Bowen. I use he, him pronouns. I am in the occupied territory of the Mohican people, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in upstate New York. And I am a South Asian male wearing a black sweatshirt. I have facial hair. And I just got a haircut, which is kind of exciting. So that hasn't happened in a long time. And that's it. Is that it? Anything else?
That's great.
Okay.
I can go. My name is Rahi Hasan. I use they, them pronouns. I'd like to do a land acknowledgement for the state I'm in, and this was provided to me by the beautiful Courtney Reed-Eaton, who is my colleague and friend from the Center for Documentary Studies where I work. I acknowledge the Kohari, Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Hollywood Saponi, Lumbee, Meherrin, Okinichi Band of Saponi, and Waccamaw Sioux peoples, whose lands include what is known today as North Carolina. I recognize those peoples for whom these were ancestral lands, as well as the many indigenous people who live and work in the region today. I acknowledge the humanity, inherent value, and labor of enslaved Africans brought to this country, and that their descendants and the immigrants and migrants who have and continue to contribute to the life and prosperity of American communities. I am a South Asian, femme-presenting, non-binary person. I have a striped blue and white top on, and I have black, dark, curly hair on one side, the other side is shaved. My room has 3 maps, one of world map, United States map, and a map of Bangladesh.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Holm, and my pronouns are she, hers. I'm a filmmaker and visual anthropologist. I also teach at Haverford College. So I usually am in Philadelphia, otherwise known as Stolen Lenape land. At the moment, however, I'm currently in Thailand. Right now, where I am, you'll see a bright red background with a painting and what I'll reveal as a fake green tree next to me. I'm wearing a black shirt. I have dark hair. and dangly earrings. And I am a multiracial Asian American woman.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. So we're all here to have a conversation about decolonizing documentaries, and hopefully everyone has read, and you're here, you read the description. And we wanted to start off with kind of just grounding how we're entering this conversation. The first line in the description is documentary film a colonial construct? So yes, it is. And then we're going to move on from there. That's pretty much how we're entering the conversation. So I'd like to open it up to everybody to maybe spend a couple of minutes just talking about what aspects of decolonization you are kind of looking at and or focused on. And then what we're going to do after we just kind of establish kind of what that is, we really want to move in to talking about what are structures, what are value systems, what are approaches and ways that you are all working within your organizations, within your own programming choices, and how we collectively can work and support around those value systems. So I'm going to start with Rahi.
Yeah, I think I want to share kind of an analogy that brought me into like my own learning around decolonial practices in documentary filmmaking, and what like led me to for my practice to be impact centered. So I initially came into documentary filmmaking from like my passion for social justice, and one of the things that was very like I was very negatively affected by in my life was people gossiping about me and like kind of talking behind my back. And almost like fabricating my identity or like my stories, basically telling false stories about me. And it happened in various iterations in real life, on social media, on the internet. And I'm not going to go dig into like why the cause of that, right? Like it could have been from their own insecurities, could have been from unhealed traumas and such, right? And I think obviously my initial feelings were like hurt, vulnerable, powerless, and you know, just kind of realizing that I can't quite stop false narratives about me because it's happening because of people's own baggage or whatever, right? So what basically, like as I was navigating those feelings in my personal experiences in my personal, that caused me a lot of unrepairable traumas and harm that was caused to me, right? It led me to documentary storytelling, and I just really saw the power in telling my own story, right? And how that can, that in itself can overpower the false stories that have been told about me, right? And so I kind of see this like strong parallel of this personal experience in the practices that happens in extractive storytelling, right? So in my personal experience scenario, there's a storyteller who's kind of creating these false stories about me and telling that, right? There is a subject. So I feel like I am a subject and not a participant because I wasn't participating in telling my story, right? And there is an audience who is listening to it, who was, I don't know if they were critically listening to that story, right? Asking questions like, okay, so what is your source of information, right? Where is, how well do you know Rahi, right? When's the last time you had a deep conversation with Rahi or like have built, or what is your relationship with Rahi to kind of tell me this story about Rahi, right? And so carrying that, I'm carrying that. That's my trauma. That's my harm that was caused to me, right? And so I bring that into analyzing my practice, my art practice of storytelling, right? And so, and I will go into that later when we talk about more like reconstructing documentary, how in the formation of Undocumented Filmmakers Collective happened because there are a lot of false narratives that are being told about our communities that is harming our community, right? And causing that damage that's kind of unrepairable because that's story is told. So in that iteration, we are created a platform where we're telling stories by us, for us, right? So yeah, and just there, I feel like there is, I can kind of deconstruct and unpack that a lot in that parallel comparison, that kind of sort of like when I'm grounding myself in my practice, why I'm telling the story I'm telling, like I'm asking myself, am I causing harm, right? So in, just to go a little bit deeper into that, so in my personal experience, when, let's say that, like what would that person who's telling false stories about me, what would they need to unlearn to kind of change that practice, right? Which it could be an entitlement, feeling that I can do this, so I'm doing it, right? One of the ways could be radical consent practice, right? Coming to me, asking me, hey, this is what I think your story is this your story, right? I want to share your story to these people. Can I do that, right? And so I think these are, and again, like I'm sharing this to like folks who are ready to unlearn at the moment, right? And I think this practices, like, because that practice was causing me harm, and in the documentary field, I'm seeing how colonial practices in extractive storytelling is causing harm. So that led me to spend a lot of time to deeply think about it, and you know, and come to the practice that I'm still learning, because yeah, there's a lot to unlearn to learn.
Yeah, thank you for that. Emily, I saw you nodding quite a lot. I was wondering if there's anything that you wanted to bring in that resonated with you with what Rahi was saying.
I mean, so much. I think, well, it's interesting that you called it radical consent, because actually this question of, is this your story and can I share this with other people, should not be a radical notion, right? That should be so basic. But in reality, that often it does happen that sometimes people do go to a film festival and they see someone they know who had no idea, right, that they were, that they were going to be in this film. So that does definitely happen. I guess, I appreciated that Rahi brought to the table their own experience and sort of how that shapes the way they look at decolonization. I think for me personally, the way that I look at it is definitely shaped by my own lived experience as someone who whose ancestors come from both sides of the colonial equation, I think, number one, and also as someone who is an anthropologist and as a filmmaker, both trades that have exceptionally colonial histories and intertwined histories, right? The first documentary is also considered an ethnographic or anthropological film. And then also my own background as an activist, I've been organizing since I was 15. So how that also shapes my thinking. And I think, one example that I'd like to bring one example to the table that I think shows what a decolonizing lens can offer in ways that, for me, get at two critical things. One is the importance of internalized colonialism and how critical that is. I think this speaks to what Rahi said about the unlearning we have to do, because each of us have basically, what is education if not lies, basically, that we have, I say this as someone who teaches in college, but basically there's so much work that we have to unlearn and really learn the true histories of our ancestors, of our people, and of other peoples that we should be in solidarity with. And then on the other hand, I think decolonizing also can give us this lens, this analysis of power, right? In ways that if we just use the lens of diversity and inclusion, that I generally, I think it's quite apolitical, right? That what does that offer? And I've been thinking about, I mean, this is not a documentary, but I know that, our audience members will be familiar with, earlier this summer, people, a lot of Asian Americans were excited about Mulan, right? Mulan was supposed to be this moment, right? That, young Asian women could see themselves somehow, right? And I think as a community, as diverse as we are, we're so thirsty for that representation because we didn't grow up seeing ourselves, right, on screen. And so I think there is that. But at the end of the day, for me, Mulan was this critical moment of reckoning, I think, for the Asian American film community, especially the documentary community, which is, are we going to align ourselves with this film when, in fact, yes, there were Asian actors on screen, but behind the scenes there were zero Asian directors, producers, screenwriters, and probably the most significant credit of that film was local Chinese government, actually, who were thanked in the credits because they shot the film in a place where the Uyghur minority community has been put in concentration camps of up to 1 million people. So I think for me, that example really shows, are we willing to have this kind of superficial representation, quote unquote, when in fact, right, if you bring a decolonizing lens to it, first of all, I think we need to also be critical of the fact that that film, and also the Asian Americans who did support that film, right, including Goldhouse, right, of where does the state and where does capital come into it, right? With every film, I think there is, we need to have this analysis, and the decolonial analysis will bring into the ways that state and capital are implicated, because that's the logic of colonialism, right? Is this kind of form of extraction, whether it is, settler colonialism or more classical forms of colonialism. So I think, again, Asian Americans, we are thirsty for representation, but we need to kind of, I think, importantly, bring this lens in terms of analysis of power and really reflect on the ways that we've internalized some of these ways of thinking.
Yeah, thank you. Bawan, let's bring you into the conversation and see kind of what's dropped in for you from Rahi and from Emily and your own thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, so much. You guys covered a lot, and I think that the one thing I just always think about is how visual imagery and film and documentary has been weaponized and has been used as a tool of the colonial project, because I think the unfortunate reality is that no matter how much we try in some ways to really kind of think about different ways of sort of diverting away from that model, in some ways we're still stuck in it, right? Because I do think that there's a part of even the terminology around decolonization that has to accept the fact that true decolonization is really about returning land and sort of, it's a sort of it's a circle that has to sort of come to some kind of, return, and that is not going to happen, right? The reality is that's not going to happen in the construct that we're in now. But we can be aspirational, and one of the things that I'm really passionate about, I mentor, I teach, I'm an educator as well as a filmmaker, and I'm the co-director of a organization called Youth FX, and runs a fellowship called Next Doc, which is also sort of turning into a little bit more of a collective structure. And I think one of the things that I think a lot about is I think about how we can dismantle some of the structures that perpetuate and uplift these modes of production, these modes of storytelling that are, as Rahi mentioned, are actually causing harm to communities. And I think that's the sort of deeper level of the story of Nanook of the North, is that, when you follow that through line of the full story, there was a lot of harm caused there. And I think that film, if you think about it, also was at the intersection of capitalism and art and film, because Flaherty, he messed up, right? Like he screwed up his reels, and he had to go back because he was being commissioned. So there, and then you look at who was commissioning him. So there's layers that I think people don't really unpack about Nanook, which are really informative when we start thinking about seeing that through line till today. And you look at even the exploitative nature of the large streamers that are now sort of, you know, rampant in the field, which are causing us as makers, even specifically BIPOC filmmakers, documentary filmmakers who are looking for opportunities to shift and kind of like swerve in ways that we don't want to. And then I think of even, you know, I know Sridevi, we were part of some conversations that Getting Real about public television. You know, this is a public space. This is supposed to be, you know, our stories, our communities, and more so than not, you see those entities being more and more replicative of corporate structures. And I think for us as filmmakers and artists, I think part of our work and our challenge is to fight and push back against those kind of practices that we see and that we witness, at the same time as we have to continue to engage in the struggle of building new structures and have to be aspirational and have to think many generations ahead of us, you know. And I think that's really where I think sometimes it's really challenging, because our field is a field that really, to me, thrives on scarcity and makes us feel like there's not enough and we all have to fight and struggle. But there is an abundance of money. I mean, you look at what's happened during the pandemic, and billionaires are making tons of profits. And you look at these streamers that are all these deals that are getting signed. And I think it's important for us to not fall into a trap where we feel like, oh, I have to fight the person next to me who looks like me. And that, well, I'm telling that story, that immigrant story or that undocumented story. No, there's space for hundreds of those stories, because we're still playing catch up. I mean, you know, we just started getting cameras in our hands about 50 years ago. And then really, I feel like right now we're in the beginning of this really incredible wave of, you know, filmmakers of color having not only just the tools of production accessible, but I think the actual like structures of production. So we now own production companies, we own studios, we have networks like ADOCs, we have film festivals like this. So we are starting to see a foundational shift that I think is really exciting. And I think part of it, as someone who is, you know, I'm 46, and you know, I got a late start as far as like actually getting a film that had backing and feeling like, okay, I can be a filmmaker. I've always been a teacher. It's been a passion of mine. So it's not something that was like a fallback. It was what I started doing as something I really wanted to do, which was teach. And then as I became interested in film, I was like, oh, there's no way I can do this for a living. Like, it's just not possible. It's too hard. But now as I, you know, mentor young filmmakers, I want them to have the aspirational, you know, vision that they can be filmmakers, that storytelling is an actual, like, incredibly important tool of culture. And, you know, we're talking about reclaiming histories and retelling, you know, stories that, you know, think about how many of us know people in our own families, in our own communities, that have no idea about our history, because that's been stolen, right? It's been taken away from us and it's been hidden from us. And I love, you know, discovering some of those histories through the films that we are making, you know. So I just have to say that I think it's like, these are great conversations. I'm so excited that so many of them are happening right now, because I think that, you know, we are really, you know, just beginning to see this wave where, you know, we are reclaiming things that we didn't have, they weren't meant for us. You know what I mean? These things were not meant for us. And I think that there's like an infinite amount of stories out there to be told, you know. So it's a very exciting time, as well as a time for us to really notice how we move through space and how we build a lot of connectivity in our work, because so many of us are doing incredible work and we're very busy people. But like, if we can start coming together on some of these initiatives and ideas, I mean, you know, we have everything we need within our communities. It's about really getting that, you know, access to those, you know, points of you know, capital, and being able to build things and be able to get the, you know, the funding and the other resources we need.
Thank you for that. And something that really resonated with me, I think that what all of you are saying is, what are the belief systems, right, that we have been taught and we have been conditioned to believe? You know, the conversation about abundance, you know, and scarcity. You know, if I get it, you don't get it, or someone's already doing that story, so you can't do that story. So with all of that, like going, all right, we're just not going to accept your belief systems. Forget it. We don't accept them. We don't agree with them. So if we move into this new structure, right, this new model, as Rahi said, reconstruction. Like, what does the value system look like? I'm curious from each of you, what are the values that should build this new structure and system, or already kind of, you all are part of building them? Would love to hear kind of what drops in for you around that. Anyone jump in?
I can share. I can share a little bit. Also, I mean, I feel like this right now is part of the reconstruction, right? I can't stop smiling when Emily and Bhavin are talking. Every time, the last few conversations that I can remember I had with Emily, I had with Bhavin were about reconstructing. You know, it's about, I remember one of the first conversations I had with Bhavin where he was kind of expressing his frustration of like, we're just tired of doing like educating about how colonized documentary is, and like, you know, we all know that, we know that. Now what? We got to organize, we got to do the work, we got to create this this foundation and the platform and the structures that we need for ourselves, and only we can do that, right? So that was a very regenerative conversations, and one of the ways is for us to figure out how can we be in spaces together, right? How can we like more and more spaces? That's for me is the foundation where we build on what we need, right? I want to bring in something that always makes me smile so much, a passage I was reading by Asada Shakur. So I'm going to read just a couple of sentences from there. This is the 21st century, and we need to redefine revolution. But I think that the way she spells it is re-evolution. It's not enough just to change the system. We need to change ourselves. Revolution is creative. Revolution means protecting the people. And I hold that so much with me in my art practice or in my documentary work. And I think when we talk about reconstructing, I really lean to this value of this, like, you know, it's not enough to change the system, we need to change ourselves. And piggybacking on what Emily was saying about, we have so much internalized colonial behaviors and white supremacy and all of that, right? So I think for me, one of the like first steps is to figure out how to unlearn those, right? And again, like, I feel like, because I'm grateful, Sridevi, that you kind of framed the panel in the beginning, that we're not talking about, like, what I'm sharing right now, it is the reconstruction, right? So we have already acknowledged documentaries, colonial and all of that, right? So starting from here, let's say, for instance, Undocumented Filmmakers Collective, right? We're pretty much mostly BIPOC folks. We came in with shared identities, shared experiences. And now it's time for us to unlearn a lot of things together, right? To be able to tell stories that are not harmful and that are ethical. So some of the values that like we kind of echoed each other in some of our initial meetings were that recognizing, so a lot of our shared experiences brought us to some shared values, like recognizing that we are in a field that's so competitive, right? That is, we're all going for the same fellowship. We're all applying for the same fund, right? So initially at that point, it was like 30 members in our collective. So for the 30 of us, we're trying to build a new world. We're trying to build a new, family. So how, like, one of the first values is that elevation, not competition, and having a strong belief that we can rise together. Foundationally, like, believing in that and centering that it is possible to rise together, right? One of the other values is, like, again, echoing what Bhavin was saying about operating from scarcity. So that is a learned behavior within us that white supremacy has instilled in us, to operate from scarcity. How do we break out of that? So I think one of the things for us is believing that we have enough. We are enough, right? Our collective, there, even till now, we were supposed to have our in-person retreat at Tribeca, but Tribeca got canceled because of pandemic, so we never had an in-person retreat, and our collective has, existed for 2 years now. And a lot of times when we were talking about community building, we were talking about coming in person together, going out for drinks, meeting up for dinners. But I think, like, Undocumented Filmmakers Collective is like a solid community, and we built it all online. So it is possible, like imagining the impossible is possible. And I think that was something that we center and we believe in, and we operate from this deep sense of like abundance, you know, and deep sense of hope. And also, I totally forgot my train of thought, but I think I'll pass it to someone else. But yeah, I guess just to wrap it up, that, you know, also another quick thing is, what are we centering as we're building community, as we are building this, restructuring this field, right? What are the pillars collectively in the BIPOC storytelling? What are the pillars that we collectively want to sort of what's the word, like dig into the ground, right? That will be standing in the shoulders of these pillars or something, is centering wellness and care, right? I think capitalism completely brainwashes us in a place that our understanding of what joy, our understanding of what care is like, we feel completely satisfied with working 40 hours and having like 3 weeks vacation in a year, right? So in our collective, we are, you know, restructuring our pay structure, right? 40 hours is not the work time. At 30 hours, let's say, is full time. And within that, our mental health care is incorporated, right? Our healing circles that we have collectively is incorporated as our work time. And so, yeah, so restructuring looks in so many different ways, and there's so much to talk about. And one other thought is that I always quote Raquel Willis, who spoke at the opening ceremony of Allied Media Conference, and said that if you want to decolonize documentary, you need to decentralize leadership. And that is something that we're practicing in our collective, because a lot of ideologies, a lot of values exist, and we're so blessed to inherit so much from Black feminist theories, from abolitionist theories that have already been so much wisdom that has been left for us, right? The only way it becomes reality is by practicing it. And it is, I think that's where the struggle is that, you know, even like in Undocumented Filmmakers Collective, we are able to practice, learn, like unlearn, learn together, experiment, and practice, right? So our collective operates completely decentralized. And, you know, we have like radical, transparent communication about everything with everyone. And as we're practicing that, we're realizing what's coming up, what's showing up, like how is white supremacy showing up in our work? How is colonial behavior showing up as we're practicing that? And that learning process is going to be long, right? It's not going to be like within a week, we're going to just unlearn everything. So, but if we don't practice, we can't really know what we need to unlearn and how we need to unlearn.
So appreciate that. I want to jump over to Emily or Bowen and say, if you guys have anything you'd like to add into this conversation about values. Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that Rahi, Bowen, and myself are all, like, none of us are doing this alone, right? And I don't think you really can do much alone, sort of, you know, in some ways, because there are parts of the filmmaking process that are quite solitary. But also, you know, if as filmmakers, you know, and as organizers, we are trying to sort of pull apart, dismantle a really colonial system of filmmaking, while at the same time creating alternatives, which I think, you know, we need to be doing both of those things at the same time. That's not something we can do alone, right? And I think, you know, Rahi, like some of the things that you mentioned around sort of like decentralizing leadership, right? And centering care, like all of these are, I think, to me, like conscious ways of, I don't think it's a coincidence, right? That they're like conscious ways of countering colonialism, but also of capitalist ways of thinking. And I think those are things that need to be done in ways that address the sort of existing hierarchies that, you know, we're inside of, right? Like we're not, none of us are outside of capitalism or patriarchy or all these forces, right? I think, you know, so I'm also involved in a couple of different like groups that help me stay accountable, honestly. And I think, and to help me reflect on, you know, it's not just Flaherty who made mistakes, right? Like I've definitely, like the films that I've made, I reflect back and I think of like, you know, why didn't we talk about money, right? Like my first film, like I really, really regret that. Like, why didn't we talk about money at all? Like I didn't plan to ever make money with it, and I didn't really, but we should have talked about that, right? Like we should talk about money, we should have talked about credits, that kind of thing. And I think, you know, having collective spaces can help you learn like from those mistakes. I think I want to also kind of, even as we're sort of building these alternatives to capitalism within the filmmaking spheres, I think it's critical for us to also recognize that there is a fundamental tension between, right, the kind of non-capitalist ways of working, which can be in collectives, but also in the process of making a film, right? Like often when we start making documentaries, pretty much until the end, like, you know, maybe we get some money, but often we're working, right, within, you know, a non-capitalist system, which is based on friendship, it's based on solidarity, it's based on these kinds of relations of exchange, right? You know, and this might be boring, but anthropologists have done a lot of research on this, right? This idea of the in non-capitalist systems, right? How do these relations of exchange, of non-capitalist exchange work? But I think, you know, I would say we can learn from that, but also the reality that we live in is actually that within in the filmmaking practice, you know, in my experience, is that those things exist in tension and in simultaneity with the capitalist system, in part because films, as sort of these relations, right, these relationships that we have with the people that we're making films with, these kind of cohere eventually into an actual thing, right, into an object, right, that, you know, in a capitalist system, that object is considered alienated from those relationships, right, and that object can then be sold, right, to a Netflix or to, right, an Amazon, God forbid, right, an Amazon. And so I think one of the things that we really need to think about is, like, even if our films don't make money, right, as directors, as producers, there are benefits that we get from that in ways that sometimes the communities that we're working with, you know, that might be collaborative in the beginning, but then what happens later? So I think there's that tension there that we need to really think through. I think one other thing I would say in terms of thinking about, you know, different value systems and thinking about alternatives is also questioning, you know, Western norms of authorship and of artistic autonomy. I think, you know, even this idea that you can kind of separate an object from the relations that created it, that is a Western notion, right? And we need to kind of provincialize that. And I think this idea that, you know, the kind of idea of autonomy that I grew up with, right, is not one in which I act in my own interests and forget about everyone else, right? Like in the Korean community, we talk, you know, we're brought up with this idea of nunchi, right? The idea that you have awareness of the people around you. And yes, sometimes it can be toxic in terms of class relations, but like, yes, you have awareness of people around you and you act sort of according to those things. And so, you know, in my own reflection upon my filmmaking work, I'm really interested in how can we challenge this narrow notion of Western autonomy, and how can we instead actually center this relational autonomy, and that might be through, you know, collectives, cooperatives, but also in the filmmaking process. What are times when we ourselves as directors and producers step back, actually, and to allow the people that, you know, are participants in our films to contribute, put on the director's hat, maybe take a credit, you know, depending on their role, and contribute creatively. And that collaborative process, I think itself can shape the filmic form in a way that is not only more ethical, but also I think, can make a more powerful film, a more beautiful film, in ways that will really resonate.
Thank you so much. I have some thoughts about that. Before we do that, I want to get to Bawan, and then we have a couple of questions from the audience. And so, Bawan, your thoughts?
First off, yeah, you guys said so much there that was amazing, and I feel like I had some like notes pre the conversation, and so like you guys are totally hitting on all of some of the things that we talked about. And I want to just say one thing that I really feel is something that helps to reshape what the work that we're doing is mentorship. And I think one of the things about I think all film and maybe all art forms is because there's not like a process or like a certification or a degree process that like, like anybody can be an artist, that's a very like kind of intrinsic natural part of being a human being is being able to express ourselves. So I think mentorship is something that I have really benefited from myself, and I am continually, offering. And I think it's one way to also sort of push back against everything having to have an assigned monetary value, because I think mentorship is something that can be a little bit here, a little bit there, or something very intensive that's like a year-long process, or you have a producer that's mentoring you. And that's been my part of my process of getting into this particular field. And I think that, one of the things that I really feel strongly about is allowing people to make mistakes. And you touched on that, Emily, and like, I feel the same way. It's like, I've definitely made mistakes in work that I've done or films, and constantly learning from it, but not assuming that like we're not all perfect. We're going to make mistakes. And I think it's understanding what the impact of those mistakes are and the ways that we can kind of find redress in certain situations when we need to, but also just to like continue to like challenge ourselves and deepen our practice and be able to be open to critique. I say one of the things that keeps me on my game as a filmmaker is that I'm surrounded by a lot of young people who have no problem, because that is encouraged in our spaces, to speak up and to say something doesn't feel right, and to pause on something, or to say we need to stop and take a break, or we're actually not going to shoot today because people don't feel well or something's off, and I think like there's a really huge aspect of I think the grind that we're all a part of, that people, oh, there's no time for that, there's no space for that. But I think that's where, again, building new structures, and you touched on this so well, Rahi, wellness and mental health and caring for each other is super important, because these are very sort of emotional practices that we're a part of too. It's like we're dealing with people's lives, and sometimes those stories involve trauma and things like that. And I've learned, from mentors like Sam Pollard and Tracy Rector, and peer mentors like Lyric Cabral, around ideas of how you build that into your productions, and that you think about it ahead of time. If I'm uncovering a story of trauma, that like I really think about how that feeds into my production budget or my team and things like that. So I think these are practices that I think I'm shocked that some of these things don't exist, and there isn't a deeper sort of like conversation around some of these things, because we are dealing with an art form that creates a level of permanence. Like I always think about that. I'm like, if I make something and it's up somewhere, wherever it may be, maybe it's on YouTube, maybe it's on my Instagram story, and I think some of those things, like someone can grab that image and it can be permanent. It can live somewhere else. It doesn't belong to me essentially once it goes out. But as the artist, like I have a responsibility to that image. And I also want to just point out one thing that I think is decentering the United States, period. The United States is not the center of the world, and I think it's important for us to understand global perspectives. Honestly, right now, I've been telling a lot of friends, I'm like, the best cinema that to me that's happening right now in the world is in Africa, on the African continent, East African films, West African films, South African films. I mean, there's incredible work coming out there, but as a marketplace in the United States, you rarely see that. You will have something break through every once in a while, but I think it's important for us to do that work and to not assume that what we see here is what the world is sort of thinking or doing in a particular moment or art form, because there's incredible and those folks need support and mentorship. That's the one thing we hear a lot is, in emerging, countries where the form is emerging and the marketplace is sort of like rushing to be like, who are the, let's anoint this filmmaker from this country, the filmmaker from India, the filmmaker from, this region. And it's like, no, there's hundreds of them. And I think it's like, how do we put resources towards those, filmmakers? And then the last thing I'll just say is that I think we need to move away from this idea of legacy filmmakers and like branded filmmakers. So like, there's been a lot of conversations around Ken Burns, and Grace Lee, shout out to Grace, another one of my, mentors who I feel really someone that, is willing to share and is so, sort of like, gracious with time and just thoughts. And she wrote this incredible piece in this Ford Foundation, 40 creatives, you can find it online about Ken Burns. And I think it's, we've accepted so many things to just be like, oh, Ken Burns documentary. It's a Ken Burns, what do they call it? The Ken Burns effect and all these things. And like, but at the same time, like what opportunities are being taken away when we only fund legacy filmmakers like Ken Burns or Steve James, and I think of, a lot of other filmmakers who have had as prolific careers in production and the work that they've produced that we don't know, that we don't see their work as uplifted and amplified by these different, networks or platforms like PBS. So, I think it's important for us to really think about how we even fall into that as filmmakers, and I think, how we sort of like spread ourselves and our knowledge and our wealth is super important. So I'm really big on mentorship and sharing and trying to sort of like demonetize that when you can. I mean, obviously people do have to, sort of earn a living. And I say all that, sort of anti-capitalist, conversations. Some people, sometimes I think it's important for us to remind there are people that need those opportunities and need to get paid and all that, need to take those opportunities for those big streaming, deals and things like that. But the point is, how do you take that deal and how do you actually, while you're there at the table negotiating that, maybe just add one new thing that they haven't thought about, bring in one thought process, advocate, for example, I tell people, I learned this from Tracy Rector, who's an indigenous First Nations filmmaker based in Seattle area. Tracy said, introduce the concept of a cultural consultant, and that's a paid position when you go into a community, you're working in a community that you're not a primary person from that community. Someone is paid to, help you understand that in a way that isn't just like coming to extract, but building a relationship, and I think it's important for us to think about the ways that we can reshape the field, because these are things that I never heard about, as I was being, sort of trained or learning as a filmmaker. So I think there's a lot of things that, and Lara Cabral brings social workers and onto the set, as she's doing interviews, so that she makes sure that if people need that added level of care, someone to talk to after the interview that unearths this thing that they didn't expect, there's someone on set while they're, doing the interviews to talk to them. So I think there's a lot of really new ideas that are out there, and it's really exciting to be part of this conversation, because I feel like I'm like taking some notes from you guys too. It's like we're all learning from each other.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we're going to get to some audience questions in just a minute, because believe it or not, we only have 10 minutes left. Okay. And I know we want to respond to our audience, but one thing I just wanted to say about this conversation about decentralization and decentering, Rahi and I were talking about the other day about the idea, or maybe it was actually Emily, you and I were talking about the idea of the average audience, the average viewer. And it's this idea when we can talk about the Ken Burns, and we talk about it from a capitalistic standpoint, Ken Burns, that name is going to bring in money. And so that's where that energy is put in. You're going to get sponsorship stations. You're going to do everything. And then when you want to bring in a different story, the conversation is, well, would the average audience like that? Would the average viewer like that? And first of all, the frustration with a comment like that is, well, who do you mean when you say average audience, average viewer? In public media, that means older white people, just frankly, and older affluent white people, let's be very clear. And then secondarily, but we've created the structure. We built up the Ken Burns in that world. We gave him the marketing and the energy and all of that space and resources. And so if we come up, why, to your point, to everyone's point, we're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're just like feeding into, instead of saying, no, let's challenge ourselves to actually say other audiences would like other things. The same audiences would like other things. Let's not just assume that only certain people will only watch certain things, right? I think that's, again, it's going to these belief systems that are, I think, really, really difficult to get past. But when you are given the space and you have people and institutions who are willing to go with it, which is the other thing I want to say before we go to audiences, I've been talking with a lot of people about this conversation in our current institutions, what needs to happen, education, we get back to the education. And I think I've come to the place that say people just need to leave and new people need to get hired. That's the truth, because if you haven't already done the work to get there, I don't know how much more I'm going to tell you to get there. And I think that's the hard thing, but it is the truth. In my experience, I will say that. And with that, I'm going to go to a question that one of our audience members has about the authentic voice. And essentially the question is like, you were talking here about that authentic voice, people who are able to tell their own stories. Where do you go? And I would add in, how do you know? What are the questions you should be asking yourself? Here I am watching a film. What is the research and homework I need to do? So anyone want to jump in on that one?
I don't know if I can fully answer the question, but I want to share something. And if we didn't go into question, that's one of the points that I was going to share. That, again, going back to just a little bit into the reconstructing process, is that, and this is, I guess I'm saying this to specific audience, folks whose stories have been told, have been stolen for centuries, and folks who are marginalized and didn't have platform to share their stories. This is like the way to move forward for me in terms of reconstructing storytelling is finding our aesthetic and not letting go of our ancestors' aesthetic, our cultural aesthetic, right? And not giving into the aesthetics that's demanded from the gatekeepers right now, right? I feel like that's a whole nother question as to like, how can that practically happen? Because we're all going for Sundance, we're all going for, like the Oscars, and that's another conversation. But coming back to the question that was asked is, I can say that follow Undocumented Filmmakers Collective, and two people I would like to mention, give a shout out to Miko Rivereza, who was one of the founding members of the Undocumented Filmmakers Collective, is completely in like one of my, someone I look up to in terms of someone who's experimenting with style, experimenting with aesthetic and new ways of telling stories. And then also Seth Hernandez Ronquillo is, has spoken a lot about undocumented aesthetic. What does that look like? And so, yeah, if you follow our collective, I think one of the things that we're really trying to uplift is that, undocumented stories have been told for decades. We didn't have the platform to, or like distribution platforms to share those stories, but those stories have been told and have existed, stories that were told by our communities for our communities, and they exist. So if you're a follower collective, we're always uplifting those authentic stories coming from undocumented communities.
Great. And I would offer a couple other organizations out there. I know I'm going to miss some, so people jump in, but there's Brown Girls Doc Mafia, there is ADOCS, the Asian American Documentary Network, there is the Black Documentary Collective. I know there are others, but definitely jump in and say, like, learn who those groups are, learn who those makers are. Follow their work, follow them on Facebook, follow them on Twitter, see what they're posting, see what art. I will tell you this, like, I started joining the collectives that were appropriate to me a year or two ago, and the number of things I have read in the last couple of years just from either their own thoughts or articles they've written, articles they posted, has been huge. And I really appreciate it so much of just going out and following the people who seem like really interesting and out there and what they're doing. All right, we're going to go to the next question. It's a question about this idea of consent, and the question you can see pop up here is, how do you feel about consent when you are telling stories about with people with power who do harm? So I would kind of rephrase that as, what does consent look like in that situation? Or how would you even approach the framing of that question, I guess? Emily or Bowen, do you want to take that?
I mean, I think there's like a lot of different nuances within that question, because I think that one of the things that I always talk about is like the minute you pick up a camera, right, there's a power shift, that power dynamic has shifted. And I think furthermore in documentary, I do think there's a number of different iterations of documentary styles and types of stories and what you're trying to sort of, the impact you're trying to have with your films. And I do think that it's really about the power differential. And I think in most cases, I do think, there's obviously films that are extremely valuable, important, investigative films uncovering, speaking truth to power and systems and political, regimes that are super important, and I think obviously you're not going to ask a dictator for their consent to do an investigative documentary about them. But I think that, when we talk about consent, we're talking about the inherent power dynamic that a filmmaker has when they come into a situation, a community with a camera and are asking people to do this, or I'm going to be filming, or to, even my sort of like, I cringe when I hear the term fly on the wall, because I think that that's really a way to sort of obscure the responsibility of a filmmaker. And I think that it's important for us to recognize the power dynamic that happens as soon as we step into a situation. There's literally, it's like almost impossible to even change just the sort of like energy in a space when a camera's in there and people are pointing at it. Even in today's age, well, everyone's got a camera. Well, that's different than you're making a film, So I think that there is a power shift and a power dynamic that you have to assess. And I think that question, I think, I'm working also in this group doing values, ethics, and accountability with some incredible people like Sonia Childress and Natalie Bullock-Brown and Molly Murphy from Story Shift and Working Films. And one of the things we talk about is the differentiation between storytelling that is about exposing power and kind of like speaking truth to power, and filmmaking that is about a community and telling a more kind of like, a story that's more personal, or maybe following somebody's journey or path. And I think that there's a lot of nuance within that. And I think it's this work that we're trying to do is to unpack the different ways that people can be more ethical and more accountable to their filmmaking practice, so that there is a way that we build in these levels of values in our work, because again, it's like we've said this a couple of times, it's super important to realize that these films have an impact, and one of the impacts has been for films has to harm people and to cause harm. And we know of documentaries that have caused people to like go into hiding because they didn't know the film was going to be released in a certain, region or country. And so it's important, as filmmakers that have had to be anonymous, so I think it's important for us to think about the power we have as we tell our stories, and then go forward and think about where is the need for consent? Where is the need for me to actually, not ask for consent because I'm exposing something that is really important for people to know more about.
Thank you so much. I think that there was so much that you said there, and I feel like we could have a whole conversation just about the consent ethics and things. And I think to reflect back what really resonated is like, what is the type of story you're telling? And then based on the story, based on, what you're going for, who is involved and how that story, there's so many of those elements. That's the difficulty of trying to do something like this in 60 minutes, right? We're going to touch on all of them. And we have one more question. And then I think after that question, we're going to have to wrap it up. So we'll do this last question. So speaking of capitalism, how can we ascribe values to films that aren't based on the box office? Who wants to take that?
I guess I could take a stab at that. I think it's a great question, and I think you're asking it in the right place. I think the Philly Asian American Film Festival, following these kind of community-based film festivals is really critical, because, I won't name names, but I would say that, I think Philly, PAAFF, the Latino Film Festival in Philly, like these are the types of festivals that I think are very conscious about how they curate films and thinking about not, who are the screenwriters, right? Who are the directors and producers? I think that's one piece. I also think that, some of the same, we can think about value in terms of profit, but value has these multiple dimensions of meaning, right? So value in terms of what are the values that we bring to the table and that are important to you as someone who, is a consumer of films or is a spectator of films. And I think, for me personally, some of the values that I've learned as an organizer from like movement-based activism, I think can be applied actually to films. And so the same values of solidarity, of accountability, of agency and autonomy, right? So these things actually are, the more we can learn about how a film is created and whether it has used some of those practices that we've talked about in this panel today, I think are really important. And part of that is, as Sri Devi pointed to, really following the work of makers, whether it's, Undocumented Filmmakers Collective, whether it's Asian American Documentary Network, Brown Girls Doc Mafia, some of the smaller collectives as well, like Riza and Ethnocene are two that I'm involved with. I think a lot of the makers that are coming out of Bawin's program our Youth FX are really incredible. So I think following, these smaller outfits actually and these community-based organizations and festivals is really the place to get to know individual makers and communities that are building these alternative systems.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would just add, since this is the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival, two organizations that are doing incredible work that are community-based, Scribe Video Center, and of course, PhillyCam. So get to know about both of them. All right, that's it for us. I want to give each of you like 60 seconds, ridiculous amount of time, right? Just any parting thoughts, anything you want to share. We'll start with Emily. Let's come back to you.
I feel like
I think we are frozen slightly. So Emily, let's come back to you and hopefully your connection will get better. Rahi, you look like your connection's solid. So let's go to you.
I think the last thing that comes to mind is, as we were talking about reconstructing, so I'm kind of imagining this like new space, right? New culture, new, a space that feels safe for folks that don't feel safe in this world, right? And I think one of the byproducts of colonialism was that for BIPOC folks to break, like our chains were broken in so many ways, right? We were kind of like lost our lands, lost our people, lost our families, things like that. So as we are moving into this, new imagination, how just to hold this, that we need to take care of each other. We need to come into spaces with unconditional love, which Sri Devi and I, from our conversation, I wanted to bring that to the space, that we come into a space with unconditional love for each other. And just remember again that I wanted to read, it is our duty to fight for our freedom, and we have nothing to lose but our chains. So how do we hold that as we are moving into this new imagination?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Emily.
Yeah, I think my connection is back now. I'm just grateful to have been a part of this conversation. I think festival conversations are really critical, but it's also just like kind of scratching the surface in some ways in terms of what we can talk about. So I think continuing to really, going back to something that Bawin said about mentorship, right? Like maybe you don't have a guru mentor, but actually what you have is, you've been to this panel, maybe you've met some people through the festival. I think also going to your peers and really thinking about, okay, I want to make a film, but I don't know how to do it. Or, I'm interested in this small piece, but I don't know how to do it. So just ask someone who has maybe done the kind of thing that, like I just sort of helped start a residency, and I went to Rahi because it was like, oh, Rahi, you've already like started this residency thing. How can we think about doing a residency that challenges these conventional models? So I think not being afraid to draw on community. And for me, Asian American Documentary Network has just been an incredible space where I can ask those questions. So if you are an Asian American filmmaker, I really encourage you to check out our network and join.
Great, thank you, Emily. Bawin?
Yeah, I mean, first off, just want to shout out the festival, and I just feel like there's something about Philadelphia. You got incredible, festivals. Black Star is another incredible festival organization, and Philly is, I mean, now will forever be known as the city that put us over the top and got rid of Donald Trump. So a lot happening in Philly. You guys have a lot to be proud of. But I just want to say, I think part of it for me is I really want to, sort of use a phrase that Chi Wei Yang coined a few years ago at Getting Real, when he said this idea of recentering and like, where are the new centers of gravity, and I think like that is what we are in the in process of right now. And to know that there's ones that have existed, Third World Newsreel, JT Tagaki and Roseli Torres and Renee Tajima Pena. There are folks who have been doing this work, and I think we're building on their sort of like hard work and struggle early on in the 60s and 70s. Really, like the first wave of BIPOC filmmakers who got cameras and started saying, fuck this, we're not going to just follow the norms, we're going to do something different. And I saw some people asking questions about like, how can I learn more? One book that I have to recommend is Pooja Rangam's book, Immediations, which is through Duke Press. I think it's the best place to get it. But I just have to say that film is all about like us coming back to realizing that these films are not about giving voice to people and accepting our responsibility as filmmakers. And then I think that can really align us around a new paradigm and a new aesthetic and a new way of thinking about the film. And I want to just say that I'm so excited right now because I think that there's a moment here where we have built some incredibly powerful institutions, ADOC, BGDM, Next Doc, Undocumented Filmmakers Collective. And now the challenge, I think, for us is how do we align? How do we come together? How do we interconnect and build a base and a foundation that we're going to look back and generations that are going to come after us are not going to have to do all that struggle and work, but they're going to come into this realm and they're going to be able to create and they're going to be able to make, incredible work and incredible films.
Thank you so much. So to echo everyone, thank you, Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. Thank you, everybody who has been part of this conversation. Thank you, Selena. Thank you, Emily, Bowen, and Rahi. I hope you all, wherever you are, have a good rest of your morning, day, or evening. And please, please take good care of yourself. Good night, or good morning, or good afternoon. Bye, everyone.
You.
You say this kill black and brown, and when will you talk about class in this story? The rest is allegory.